Rain on courthouse steps falls the way certain moments do. Without ceremony, without permission, choosing no particular hour to begin. Thomas Gale noticed the woman before he noticed the rain had started. She was sitting on the top step of the Harwick County Courthouse on a Wednesday afternoon in early March, with a paper bag from the sandwich shop across the street going soft in her hands, and no coat on her shoulders, despite a temperature that had been threatening something worse than overcast since morning. She was perhaps 70, perhaps older. She had the kind of face that belonged to a woman who had made many decisions and regretted very few of them. Not untouched by time, but settled in a way that suggested she had arrived at a particular understanding with it. The rain came without announcement. It was the kind of rain that does not build gradually. It arrives all at once, as if deciding mid-thought to commit. Thomas was already halfway down the steps when he stopped. He had an umbrella. He had a meeting at the legal aid office 2 blocks east at 3 o'clock. He had a daughter to pick up from school at 4:30, a bus to catch, a case that was burning through the last of what he'd saved, and zero margin for anything outside the schedule he had kept without deviation for 6 months. He stopped anyway. He walked back up the steps and held the umbrella over her. She looked at him. She did not look startled, the way people sometimes do when they receive kindness without having planned for it, as if they had forgotten to budget for it. She looked at him with calm, measured attention and said, "You were going somewhere." "I still am," Thomas said. 3:30. He checked his watch. "I have time." She moved to one side of the step without being asked, and he sat beside her. Not because sitting was part of the plan. Because she made room, and it seemed impolite not to take it. Her name was Margaret. She offered it the way you offer something you have no reason to withhold. Thomas offered his, in return. They sat watching the rain move across the courthouse plaza, without speaking for a moment, which told him something about her before she had said anything of substance. The paper bag in her hands was softening at the bottom. After a moment, Thomas said, "You're losing your lunch." She looked down at it. "I am." She did not appear distressed. "I should eat it before it becomes something else." "You should eat it under the umbrella," he said, "before it becomes something else." The corner of her mouth moved. "That is the more accurate advice." She ate. He held the umbrella. The rain continued its conversation with the plaza. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button, subscribe to Hidden Ledger, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. She was sitting on those steps for a reason he didn't know yet. Neither did she. Not fully. Keep watching. Thomas Gale had learned to carry an umbrella the way he had learned most of the things that now kept his life functioning. Out of necessity, after not doing so had cost him something he couldn't replace. He was 41 years old. His daughter, Nora, was 9. She had her mother's way of looking at something and finding the funniest possible version of it. The kind of inheritance that could either break your heart on a daily basis or redeem whatever part of the day had gone badly, depending on how you were standing when she looked at you. Thomas was usually standing right. He had worked out, over the years, that parenting alone was a series of small negotiations with the person you used to be before you knew what the job required. The person he used to be had believed that keeping things calm and predictable was the same as keeping things good. The person he had become understood that calm and predictable could be two very different things, and that what Nora needed from him was not the performance of steadiness, but the real version of it, the kind that came from somewhere and could be felt. He was still building that. Some mornings he thought he had it. Other mornings she looked at him across the cereal, and he could tell from the specific quality of her attention that she was taking stock of something she wasn't going to name, and he felt the weight of everything she was quietly deciding not to ask. He had been a senior financial analyst at Caldwell Meridian Group for 11 years. The role was not glamorous. Financial analysis rarely is, outside of movie adaptations. But it was precise, and Thomas had been precise. He caught things. His former manager had once called it his most valuable quality, a way of looking at a column of numbers and hearing when something in the rhythm was wrong, the way a mechanic hears an engine note that doesn't belong. 14 months ago, he had heard something wrong. It was in the subsidiary accounts. Not obvious, the kind of wrong that required knowing the instrument well enough to notice when the sound changed by a quarter step. A series of intercompany transfers that ran clean on the surface but, mapped against the original project allocations, described a pattern with no legitimate explanation. Money cycling through a third-party vendor account and returning as project overhead. Not a large amount in the first pass. Enough, by the third, to represent what Thomas's arithmetic told him was a systematic overstatement of project costs, and with it, a systematic inflation of management bonuses tied to those exact cost metrics. He documented what he found. He was thorough because thoroughness was his nature, and because 11 years in a company that rewarded documentation had made it instinct, and because some part of him already understood that documentation was the only form of insurance that reliably paid out. He brought his findings to his direct supervisor, Kenneth Marsh, in a closed-door meeting on a Thursday afternoon. Kenneth listened. He nodded at what seemed like the appropriate moments. He said he would look into it and that Thomas had done exactly the right thing. 3 weeks later, Thomas was called into a meeting with Kenneth and a woman from Human Resources named Diana Sloan, who placed a performance improvement plan in front of him and explained that his recent work had shown a pattern of disengagement and declining quality. Thomas had never received a negative review in 11 years. He asked for specifics. The specifics were general. He asked for examples. The examples were vague. He asked, very carefully, whether this had anything to do with the concerns he had raised about the subsidiary accounts. Kenneth said, "That's a completely separate matter." Diana Sloan said, "This is about your performance." Thomas signed nothing. He went home, sat at the kitchen table while Nora slept, and began a second round of documentation, this time of the meeting itself. The dates, Kenneth's precise phrasing, the sequence. He sent copies to his personal email. He called an employment attorney the following morning. 2 weeks after that, he was terminated. The stated reason was violation of a confidentiality policy. He had forwarded internal documents to a personal account. The documents he had forwarded were the records of the financial irregularities he had discovered. His attorney, a woman named Petra Gould who operated out of a 3-room office above a dry cleaner, and who had a framed cross-stitch on her wall that said, "Documentation is love" in cheerful yellow thread, filed a wrongful termination complaint immediately. She also referred the subsidiary account records to a regulatory contact she trusted. The regulatory process was slow. Lawsuits were slow. Everything was slow except the rate at which Thomas's savings moved in the wrong direction. He found part-time work doing tax preparation for a small firm. He cut everything that could be cut. He told Nora they were doing a kind of experiment, living on the essentials, seeing what they actually needed, the way explorers did. Nora said explorers had better food. He agreed she had a point. He had not told her why he had lost his job. She was 9. She understood that he had lost it, that things were tighter than they had been, and that he was working on fixing it. She understood that he went to meetings sometimes, at an office downtown, and came home quieter than he had left. She also understood, with the accuracy of a child who had been paying close attention for 4 years, since her mother died of a sudden illness when Nora was 5, that her father's quietness was not defeat. It was the face he made when he was thinking through something hard and keeping the thinking away from her. She let him have the thinking. She did the dishes without being asked, kept her room tidy, and sometimes when he came back from the downtown meeting she had made tea, badly, the bag left in too long, and set it on the kitchen table with a note that said simply, "Hi, Dad." Thomas kept every one of those notes in the drawer by the sink. Margaret finished her sandwich without rushing. The reins settled into a lighter register. Still present, no longer performing. "You were at a hearing," she said. It was not quite a question. Thomas looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The folder." She nodded at the manila envelope under his arm. "And the look. People who come to courthouse buildings for other reasons don't carry that specific look." "What specific look?" "Like you've been preparing for something for a long time, and you're now in the part of it that doesn't move at the speed you prepared for." He considered this. "That's accurate." "Wrongful termination," she said. He looked at her again, with something that wasn't quite surprise. "You're perceptive." "I'm old," she said. "Perceptive is what happens when you stop needing to pretend you didn't notice something." He told her the shape of it. Not the detail, the outline. The job, the discovery, the termination, the case now moving through a system that moved the way rivers move around objects. Eventually, but not directly, she listened the way very few people listened, which was without preparing her response while he was still speaking. "Your daughter," she said, when he had finished. "How old?" 9. She was quiet for a moment. "Does she know what you found?" "She knows I told the truth, and it cost me something," Thomas said. "I thought that was the version that would be useful to her." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That is the version that's true," she said, "which is the same thing for a 9-year-old. The rain had thinned to something almost finished. Thomas checked his watch. He still had time. He had kept his margin. "I have to go," he said. "Yes." She rose slowly, with the deliberateness of a woman whose body required a brief conversation with each movement before it would cooperate. "Thank you." "For the umbrella." The umbrella was self-interest, Thomas said. "I didn't want to sit in the rain either." The corner of her mouth moved again. More this time. He walked down the steps toward the legal aid office. He did not look back. He was focused on the 3:30, the school pickup at 4:30, the evening. He did not know, crossing the rain-wet plaza with his umbrella and his careful attention on the time, that the woman he had just sat with was Margaret Alcott. He did not know that the Alcott Foundation had been funding his legal case for 4 months. He did not know that it was Margaret herself who had read the summary of his complaint, all 37 pages of it, the documented subsidiary accounts, the meeting notes, the performance improvement plan, the termination letter, and had told Petra Gould's contact at the foundation, "This is exactly what we're here for." He went to his meeting. If you haven't subscribed to Hidden Ledger yet, this is the moment. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Your support is what keeps these coming. Stay with this one. There's more to what just happened than either of them knew. The Alcott Foundation was not a well-known organization. That was by design. Margaret had established it 9 years earlier, 3 years after her husband Arthur had retired from financial services, and 2 years after a conversation she'd had at a charity luncheon, entirely by accident, with a former employee of one of Arthur's companies. A man who told her, quietly, with no expectation of anything from the telling, what had happened to him after he reported a billing irregularity and lost his position of 16 years. Margaret had listened. She had asked questions. She had gone home and asked Arthur the same questions, sitting at the kitchen table, and Arthur had answered them with the careful honesty of a man who had spent a career at the edge of practices he had chosen not to examine too closely. They sat with the answers for a long time. Arthur had been, in the way of men who built large things over long periods, a person who preferred not to look at the shape of what he had built from the outside. He looked at the work. He looked at the outcome. He trusted the people between those two things. He trusted them, as he told Margaret at the kitchen table that night, because trusting them was easier than auditing them, and he had always known that, and he had never said it to himself in language that plain. There was not an argument between them that evening. There was something quieter and harder, the kind of conversation that changes the accounting of a life without requiring a single raised voice. Margaret had asked Arthur what he intended to do with what he now understood. He had said, "Whatever you think is right." He had meant it. That was the thing about Arthur that Margaret had loved for 44 years. He was capable of choosing correctly, but he was better at choosing her judgment than his own when the two diverged, which had always been a rarer quality in a man than the world gave credit for. The foundation came out of that conversation. Its mandate was specific: wrongful termination cases involving employees who had reported financial misconduct and been retaliated against for it. It did not advertise. It did not hold fundraisers. It operated through referrals from a network of employment attorneys, received applications, and chose cases based on criteria Margaret had written herself, and revised 3 times over the first 2 years, until she was satisfied they said what she meant. Thomas Gale's case had come through Petra's contact in November. Margaret had read it over 2 evenings at the desk in the room she used for foundation work. A cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink going cold beside her. The case was not unusual in its structure. 11 years of solid performance. A discovery. A report to internal management. 3 weeks of silence, and then a sequence of manufactured cause that moved with the specific efficiency of an organization that had done this before. What was unusual was the documentation. Thomas had sent himself 43 separate items before the termination letter arrived. He had dated and time-stamped each one. He had kept the original emails alongside his forwarded copies, which meant that the company's stated reason for firing him, the unauthorized forwarding of internal documents, was simultaneously the most complete evidence that what he had forwarded was legitimate. Margaret had found this almost elegant. He had built his own defense out of the mechanism of his own firing. She had approved the funding without hesitation. She had not met him. The foundation almost never met clients in the early stages. Margaret had learned over the years that meeting a person changed the evaluation in ways that weren't always improvements. Documents were cleaner. Documents told you what happened. People told you how it felt, which was important, but differently. She had gone to the courthouse that Wednesday for a different reason, a hearing in an older case, reaching its conclusion at last. She had sat on the steps afterward, because the air after a hearing sometimes needed to settle before she could think clearly inside a car. The rain arrived without notice, and a man with an umbrella came back up the steps. She had not told him on those steps because she had not yet decided to tell him, and Margaret had learned over 72 years that the decisions she made before deciding were the ones she most wanted back. She thought about it that evening. She called Petra's contact the following morning. The Gale case. I met him. A pause. The client? On the courthouse steps. He didn't know who I was. Another pause. What did you tell him? Nothing. A beat. I listened. She met with Petra directly 3 days later. Petra explained where the case stood. The regulatory complaint had triggered an examination. The examination had found enough to issue a formal inquiry to Caldwell Meridian. The company's outside counsel had responded with a motion that said, in legal language, the inquiry was baseless. The response you got, Petra said, when a baseless motion was the only card left that bought time. How long does it buy them? 3 to 4 months, probably. Long enough to wear him down, if he's going to be worn down. He's not, Margaret said. She said it without thinking, which told her something. Is there anything that would accelerate the regulatory piece? More evidence. The kind that comes from inside the company. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What kind is missing? Petra named it, the authorizations. The documents showing who had approved the vendor account structure before it went active. Thomas had found the pattern in the output, the money moving in and returning. What he had not found, because it had not been in the materials he could access, was the chain that authorized it. Who had set it up? Who had signed off? Who had known from the beginning? If those documents exist somewhere, Margaret said, who would have them? Petra looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been in rooms like this before. Someone who was at the table when the structure was designed. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'd like to speak to Thomas Gale directly. The call came to Petra's office on a Thursday morning. Thomas was there for a case update. Petra told him the foundation funding his legal costs had requested a direct meeting. Which foundation? The Alcott Foundation. He knew the name from the funding documents Petra had shared months earlier. He had been grateful for it in the abstract way. You are grateful for something whose source you cannot quite reach. The way you are grateful for rain after a long dry stretch, without knowing where the weather came from. Why do they want to meet? They have something to give you. I think it's better if you hear it from them directly. The meeting was in a small conference room, 3 streets from Petra's office. Thomas arrived early. He sat with his folder across his knees and tried not to predict what the unusual thing meant, which was a skill he had gotten better at, but had not yet fully developed. The door opened. Margaret Alcott walked in. Thomas looked at her. She looked at him. He recognized her in approximately the same moment she expected him to. The courthouse step, the umbrella, the softening bag. The umbrella, he said. The umbrella, she confirmed. She sat across from him and placed her hands flat on the table. I owe you an apology, she said. I knew who you were on those steps. Well, I didn't tell you. Thomas was very still. You knew. I had read your file. I hadn't seen your face. I knew your name when you gave it. She held his gaze steadily. I decided not to say anything. I was wrong to wait as long as I did, and I'm not going to explain it in a way that makes it sound better than it was. He looked at her for a long moment. What Margaret would later tell Petra was the thing the documents had not shown, could not show, was that Thomas Gale's stillness was not anger-building. It was the stillness of a person with long practice at absorbing information before reacting to it. What do you have? He said. She set a folder on the table. Inside were 4 documents, photocopies from a careful personal archive. Each bore the letterhead of a consulting arrangement that had existed, as far as Thomas could reconstruct on first reading, before the vendor account structure he had found. Each bore 2 signatures, Kenneth Marsh, and the name above Kenneth Marsh, Caldwell Meridian's chief financial officer. The authorizations, Thomas said slowly. Yes. Margaret's voice was steady. My husband had a consulting relationship with Caldwell Meridian in the years before he retired. He reviewed their financial architecture as part of a long-term risk assessment. He was shown these documents as part of that review." End quote. A pause. He did not approve of what they described. He kept copies. Thomas looked up from the folder. "Arthur Alcott. He died 14 months ago." She said it the way you say things you have had time to absorb, but have not finished absorbing. "He asked me to make sure they were used correctly." That was the phrase he used. Correctly. She looked at the documents between them. He was a precise man. Thomas sat with the folder in front of him for a long time. There were no clocks in the conference room. The rain, it was raining again, the persistent March kind that didn't particularly want to be there, but hadn't found a reason to stop, made a quiet sound against the window. "You built the foundation because of what he told you," Thomas said. "I fund cases like yours," Margaret said, "because the person who told the truth lost something they shouldn't have lost, and because the people who made the decision that cost them something should face it in a room where the same documentation they hoped would disappear is sitting on the table." Thomas closed the folder. "Petra should have these. The originals went to the regulatory office this morning," Margaret said. "Those are your copies." The authorization documents changed the nature of the inquiry. What had been an examination of Thomas's termination became something broader, an investigation into whether the vendor account structure constituted a deliberate misrepresentation of project costs, and whether the termination of the employee who discovered and reported it constituted obstruction of something much larger. Kenneth Marsh resigned 3 weeks after the documents reached the regulatory office. He issued no statement. He did not appear to have a plan for what came after the resignation, which was, Thomas thought when he read it, what happened when a plan had been built entirely around not getting caught. The CFO engaged outside counsel and cooperated in the limited way that cooperation and self-protection are sometimes the same motion. There were negotiations. There were documents. There was a settlement Thomas was not party to, but whose existence became public record. Caldwell Meridian's board agreed to an independent review of its vendor account structure and incentive compensation arrangements. The results came 8 months later in a report that was careful in its language and unambiguous in its findings. Thomas's wrongful termination case settled 4 months after the regulatory investigation opened. He was not required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Petra told him this was unusual, and that the company's willingness to agree said something about the position they were in by the time they came to the table. She said it with the satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting several months to say it, and Thomas let her have it, because she had earned it at least as much as he had. He used the settlement to clear the remaining debt, put 3 months of expenses into reserve, and hire a part-time bookkeeper for the tax preparation work he had built into something nearly a practice. He kept the schedule that got Nora to school and back, and the evenings free for homework, and the badly made tea, and the notes that still appeared on the kitchen table when she thought he needed one. He did not return to corporate financial work. He thought about it and found what came to mind was the Thursday afternoon meeting with Kenneth Marsh, the 3 weeks of silence that followed it, and the performance improvement plan with its general specifics and vague examples. He had been very good at working inside a system and less attentive to whether the system deserved the work. That was now a thing he was attentive to, and it changed what he wanted to do. A nonprofit offered him a position reviewing financial reporting for smaller charitable organizations, the kind that ran on goodwill, often operated by people with no particular expertise in the documents they were signing. It paid less than Caldwell Meridian. It paid enough. He took it, he thought, the first morning he sat down at the new desk, that he would feel something ceremonial about it, some sense of a door closing or another opening. What he felt was much simpler than that. He felt that the work in front of him was the right size, and that the right size was something he had undervalued for a long time. He called Nora on his lunch break that first day. She was at school and didn't answer. He left a voicemail that said, "Just wanted to tell you it's going well. See you at pickup." He paused before he hung up. "Good braids this morning, by the way. I'm getting better." He was not getting better at the braids. He was not going to stop trying. Margaret came to Nora's school play in April. She had not been specifically invited. Petra had mentioned the play in passing, and Margaret had decided she would go because formal conclusions were never quite the thing itself. She sat in the back row where she could see without being in anyone's way. Nora played a lighthouse keeper in what appeared to be an original story, written collaboratively by the 3rd grade. which explained why the lighthouse keeper also had a dog that solved a subplot involving a missing key. Nora had her lines completely and delivered them with the confidence of a child who had practiced until they became natural, looking at the audience at exactly the right moments without losing the character. Thomas was in the third row. He was recording on his phone with the careful ineptitude of a parent who has never entirely worked out the Zoom function, but is not going to stop trying. He had saved the seat beside him the way people save seats when they are expecting someone. At intermission, he found Margaret in the back row. "I thought you might be here," he said. She did not ask how he'd known. "How's the second act?" "The dog finds the key," he said. "I won't tell you how." He walked her forward to the seat he had saved. He said nothing about it being saved. She said nothing about it either. They watched the second act. The dog found the key. The lighthouse keeper kept her post. The ship made it to shore. The applause at the end was the kind that only happens in elementary school auditoriums. Complete, without any component of performance. Everyone in the room meant it entirely. Nora took her bow. She found her father in the audience, and her face went through several things at once. Then she found Margaret beside him. She waved from the stage with both hands. That evening, after Nora was asleep with her program still on her nightstand, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. Made correctly now, the bag pulled at the right time, the way Margaret had mentioned one afternoon, when they were sitting at the conference table after the case resolved, and she had made tea from the small kettle she kept in the corner, because she had learned, over many such conversations, that important things needed something to do with your hands. He sat with the tea and thought about what he had told Nora 14 months earlier, on a night when they were very close to the bottom of what they had, and she had come downstairs quietly and asked him whether telling the truth was always worth it. He had told her that the truth was the part that mattered. He had believed it the way you believe things, when you are not yet sure they are going to prove true, but you think they should be, and the space between belief and knowledge is the part of the road you haven't walked yet. He had walked it now. The cost had been real. He did not revise it downward. 14 months of the wrong kind of tight. Of school trips he had said yes to, and then quietly found a way to make work. Of evenings when he came home present but carrying something that had nothing to do with the hour. The cost was real, and it had cost exactly what it cost. So was what it had produced. He had held an umbrella over a woman eating a softening sandwich in the rain, and had not asked anything in return except that she eat it before it became something else. He had not known she was Margaret Alcott. He had not known she had been reading his case for 4 months. He had not known she was carrying her husband's documents in a careful archive, kept precisely because her husband had believed, with the stubbornness of a man who had spent a career on the wrong side of something and crossed back, that precision was a form of care. Thomas had known only that it was raining, and he had an umbrella, and he had time. That had been enough. He put the cup in the sink, turned off the kitchen light, and checked on Nora. She was asleep, the program on her nightstand, her lighthouse keeper at rest after the storm. He pulled the door almost closed and went back to the kitchen. He opened the drawer by the sink, the one that held Nora's notes, a small archive of Hi Dad, and the dates and the things that needed no other explanation, and he wrote one of his own. Not long, just the date and 3 words, the same currency she had been leaving for him, returned in kind. He put it where she would find it in the morning. He went to bed. Outside, the April evening settled into something quiet and clear. The last light above the horizon was going slowly, the way spring light goes, as if it has somewhere to be, but is in no particular hurry to arrive. The stars, when the light finally finished, were very clear. They had been there all along, waiting for the darkness to make them visible. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay are the ones who understand what it's actually about. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are ready to do the same. And if you haven't found Hidden Ledger yet, come find us. Every story we tell is about something written down and nearly lost. We think it's worth reading. We think you do too.